Good morning. Good morning. This is Valerie Leonard. I am the founder of nonprofit Utopia. I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an interesting month for us. We're going to be focusing on how to develop um, federal grants, and we're going to show you today how to assess your capacity to actually apply for federal grants. And just so you know, there is no policy that says that you can't apply for federal grants if you don't have a certain capacity level, but it just makes sense for us to share with you how important it is to shore up your capacity so that you can compete effectively. The only thing that's required to actually apply is to have 501c3 status, be in good standing, but you will be judged according to your capacity. All right, so today we're going to actually go through a HUD CHOTO checklist. This is going to be an example of what nonprofit organizations should have in place in order to compete effectively. And we're going to also share with you not only that assessment tool that they use, but the checklist that they use to actually evaluate proposals. And this is just an example of one federal agency and what they use, but it should be noted that the requirements are similar from federal agency to federal agency. All right. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen. And if you have any questions or comments, um, please feel free. All right. Okay, so just one moment. All right, so this is going to be the CHOTO self-assessment tool. And just so you know what CHOTO stands for, this is a program that is sponsored by HUD. It is for affordable housing, and this is for organizations that are interested in creating a community-based housing development organization. All right. And just so you know, too, again, these assessment tools are similar from agency to agency. And the first thing that they ask that you ask of yourself, and you remember this is a self-assessment tool, is what is the organization's status and mission? So at a very minimum, you should be organized under the state or local laws. So you should have a charter, a state charter, or articles of incorporation to show that you're registered to actually do business in the state that you're doing business in. And you have to have a tax exempt status, if you're a nonprofit. So you should be a 501c3 or a 501c4, and you should have that letter of determination. And then if you are a group, you could have a group exemption letter under Section 905 from the IRS, and that includes the CHOTO. And then you also have to have among your purposes the provision for low and moderate income housing. And that should be actually in your charter your articles of incorporation, your bylaws, or in your resolutions, right? And this is for the CHRL. You don't necessarily have to have this provision in your bylaws if you're not a housing development organization, right? Um, Additional questions include, do you have a certificate of good standing? That means, have you in fact completed all the filings at the state level? And you can prove that and get a certificate from your state. When we look at your service area, do you have a documented service area, either in your articles of incorporation, your mission statement, that's consistent with CHRL activities? And again, this is for housing. If you are doing social services, you probably need to have a documented social services that's consistent with the activities of whatever federal agency there is. All right, have you done a strategic plan? And is the strategic plan specific and it has housing development in it? And if you're not a housing development organization, do you have a strategic plan? What's your organization structure like? Does your organization have a development subsidiary or other structural method of ensuring that it can undertake development without diverting time and resources from other activities? Again, this is for housing, but you should also, consider, if you're an organization that's doing something in addition to housing or other than housing, or you're even thinking about bringing on housing, how is this large project going to impact what you do on a day-to-day basis, right? And then is there a shared commitment amongst your board and staff? Is your board committed to doing housing? Is your board committed to um, doing other activities? Again, if this is a housing assessment, but if you're not in the business of doing housing, is there a shared commitment from your board to engage in the activities that will help you fulfill the mission? Is there a capital advance set aside? And how has the organization actually set aside funds to actually engage in development? And this again is for housing. But if you plan to do an expansion project, and you're seeking funds to do expansion for your social services, and it involves housing or some other building, that's going to be a question that's relevant to you as well. And this question is pertaining to the CHRL program. The CHRL program is designed such that they want to make sure that there's representation from very low income people on the boards. So you have to have at least a third of your board membership for residents of low income neighborhoods or other low income community residents, or elected officials from low income neighborhood organizations. And this should be documented in your bylaws, charter, or articles of incorporation. And again, this threshold is only for housing organizations that want to seek official CHRL status. But this is, still an interesting thing to understand, for those of you who are thinking about starting nonprofit organizations and you want to make sure that you have representation that is reflective of the community you serve. So you might use this as a model to think about how you make sure that the low income community that you're serving is in fact represented on your board, and how do you document that in your bylaws, in your charter, and or the articles of incorporation. All right, and then again, this is another CHRL requirement. No more than a third of your governing members can be public officials. And again, this is only for the CHRL program, but it might be instructive for people who are thinking about creating a board where they might consider having elected officials on the board. You know, there's pros and cons to having elected officials on your board, but this might be a way of looking at how you might incorporate elected officials on your board. Again, that can be documented through your bylaws, through your charter, and or your articles of incorporation. And I'm saying and or because I'm not looking at this just for the CHRL program, even though we're using a CHRL example. I think that this can be a model for anyone who is assessing their capacity to apply for federal funding. So if the CHRL is sponsored or created by a for-profit entity, the for-profit entity may not appoint more than 1/3 of the membership of the CHRL's governing body, and the board members appointed by the for-profit entity may not, in turn, appoint the remaining 2/3 of the board members, as evidenced by the CHRL's bylaws, charter, or articles of incorporation. So just so you know, you would score yourself as adequate in this area or you have a deficiency in this area. All right. And this is interesting too, because again, it shows a model for those people who are not in housing of how you might create a board. You know, suppose you wanted a board that has composition from the community, you know, low income residents. If you want to also include people who are for profit and people who are elected officials, the CHRL model is a great way to look at it, you know, and use it for your own purposes, you know, whether you're in social services, education, or what. Now, these are questions that are relevant to any nonprofit organization. You want to be able to demonstrate board stability. So you look at yourselves and you ask the question, has there been stability or continuity amongst board members over the last several years? So what does continuity and stability look like? That might look like different things for different people, but stability of board typically means that people, you know, you regularly have a quorum at your board meetings. You have 4 minutes to document the progress. There's actually progress being made. You're not stuck on certain issues. You are able to retain board members and people are able to move forward, right? Because the agenda is being pushed forward. And then development oversight. Does the board have a committee structure or other means of overseeing planning and development? So this could be for housing purposes. Obviously, you want to have have a board that is capable of overseeing planning and development. Capable meaning there's some board member who has experience in real estate development. There may other there may be other board members who have experience financing board and financing real estate development. And then this doesn't necessarily have to be applicable for organizations that are doing housing development. You, again, if you are a social service agency that is looking to expand, you know, purchase a large building and rehab it or even develop a building, that would be applicable. Board skills. Do board members have professional skills directly relevant to housing development? For example, real estate, legal, architecture, finance, and management. Has the board demonstrated the ability to make timely decisions? That's where your board minutes come into play. You look at a history of your agenda items. You look at the voting records. You see how long certain items have been on the agenda. If you have the same agenda items on the agenda for every meeting for 6 months, that's that's typically an indicator that the organization is not making decisions on a timely basis, right? So you want to be able to demonstrate that decisions are being made on a timely basis. That means that the item is on the agenda. You have evidence of a vote one way or the other. There's evidence of some discussion, although you don't have to record every blow by blow, but you want to be able to demonstrate that there is a duty of loyalty that's being carried out, meaning that there's no conflicts of interest. There's also duty of care that's being taken into consideration, meaning that there is good discussion and no rubber stamps, right? And then you want to look at board and staff relations. Is there a good relationship between the board and staff? Do they have shared goals? And even though that's probably not something you want to talk about, it does become, very apparent when you look at documentation that you would need to supply, right? Again, and one of the indicators of dissension would be, looking at the board minutes and seeing how long it takes for things to move forward and some of the reasons why things are not moving forward. All right. So when we look at independence, right? The regulatory thresholds, meaning what HUD's requirements are, is the CHOTO is not controlled. It doesn't receive directions from individuals or entities seeking profit from the organization, as evidenced by your bylaws or your MOU. All right. And one way to prove that, right, is to show that you have the language in your articles of incorporation, and it should also be in your bylaws, that is taken directly from the IRS, which is another federal government agency, that indicates that that no profits are being um, are coming to any member of the organization. And it also you can also look at the board composition as well, to make sure that, people don't have a financial interest and therefore can exert some sort of control in the organization. And if this entity is created by a for-profit entity, your purpose doesn't include the development or management of housing, because you want to make sure that there's no conflicts of interest. And again, when you start an organization, you also have to indicate to the IRS that you don't have any conflicts of interest. So if if the organization is sponsored or created by a for-profit, the CHOTO is free to contract for goods and services from vendors of its own choosing, as evidenced by bylaws, charter, or articles of incorporation. And again, you want to make sure that there are no conflicts of interest. You want to make sure that people on your board are not profiting financially from being on your board. And you should have all kinds of systems in place to make sure that doesn't happen. If the organization is sponsored by a religious organization, the CHOTO is a separate secular entity from the religious organization, with membership available to all persons regardless of religion or membership criteria, as evidenced by the bylaws, charter, or articles of incorporation. And again, this is a checklist for HUD, for people who have organizations that want to actually go into housing development and get CHOTO status. But these questions are very, very helpful to people, regardless. of what business their organization is in. Additional questions, identity of interest. Are there any identity of interest issues between the organization and the contracts, consultants, and professionals that it uses for its total projects that might constitute a conflict of interest? Again, you have to assess whether or not that's adequate or you have a deficiency. If it's adequate, you have no conflicts of interest, or if there is a conflict of interest, you've been able to document ways that you can get rid of the conflict of interest. And if there are other issues that you have that might impact independence, for example, you might have a husband and a wife on the board, that could be a problem. Family members, people who might be on the same board of another organization, anything that might be perceived to show that members are less than independent from another organization would be helpful. And then you want to look at your relationship to the community. Does the community have a history of serving the community within which housing to be assisted with home funds is to be located, as evidenced by documentation of at least 1 or more year experience in serving the community, or for new organizations, documentation that its parent organization has at least 1 year of experience in the community? Another question. Do you provide a formal process for low-income program beneficiaries to advise the organization in decisions regarding the design, siting, development, and management of affordable housing projects? So when we're talking about the siting, we're talking about designing the actual physical space, and also selecting the location. So the low income program people, are they actually involved in a major way in the decisions? And again, if you're not doing housing, and if you are a staunch believer in diversity and equity, this might be a model for you in terms of how you approach the community. Do you have a formal process for people in the community that you serve to actually play a role in the major decisions in a major way, and not just through surveys and other token representation? Additional questions for the needs. Are current plans well grounded in an understanding of current housing conditions, housing needs, and the need for supportive services? Have you done an analysis of the local housing market and the local needs of local income households? Which I think is a very good question. Now, if you're not doing housing, you can adapt this question and make sure that you are, in fact, doing community needs assessments for whatever your services are. And even beyond the needs assessments, are there demands? Is there a demand for your service? Just because the community needs it doesn't necessarily mean that they want it. So you want to create programs and services that are relevant and demanded of the community, by the community. Community relations. How strong are your relationships? Do you have a strong reputation with the community? And the strong reputation, is it positive or is it negative? And then NIMBY, not in my backyard, so to speak. Everybody says they want affordable housing, but nobody wants it in their neighborhood. Even low income communities don't want affordable housing. The same can be true of mental health agencies, right? The same can be said of agencies that serve ex-offenders. If you're dealing with a controversial topic, do you have strategies in place to work with the community to resolve any issues that might prevent you from going forward? Local government relations. How strong is the Chodo's relationship with the local government? How strongly does local government support its housing activities? Again, that's pretty straightforward for organizations that want to do housing. But then again, if you're working with um, in anything with nonprofits, how strong is your relationship with the local government? Not that you can spend a whole heck of a lot of time lobbying, but you can spend a significant amount of time doing advocacy on behalf of your clients and not just your clients, but also the entire community. So, how strong are your relationships? Are your are your relationships strong enough to actually make things happen in a positive way for the community? And are there other community issues that you need to deal with? And you might want to rate yourself as to how effective you are in dealing with those issues. And then financial management and capacity, a regulatory threshold, and this is for the federal government, and this is for any agency, regardless of whether it's HUD, whether it's Health and Human Services, transportation. You have to make sure that you conform to financial accountability standards of 24 CFR 84.21, standards for financial management systems, and you would need to have evidence of that. So that includes a notarized statement from the president or your chief financial officer, a certification from a CPA, or a HUD approved audit summary. So as you can tell, applying for federal funds, even though you can be a startup and apply, you clearly see that there's significant work to be done in order for you to demonstrate that you have the capacity to manage federal funds. Additional financial management questions on the audit. Does your organization have an annual audit? And is the most recent audit current? So has it been done within the last fiscal year? Were there any audit findings? And when we talk about findings, we're talking about um, the management letter that goes with the CPA report, saying that there's some things that need to be corrected in terms of the management systems. So if you have an audit letter, if you have a management finding from your CPA, they also give recommendations as to how you can improve. And you want to be able to demonstrate that those findings have been resolved. And if they haven't been resolved, you want to be able to show that you have a strategy for resolving them. Budgeting. Does the organization have an annual budgeting process, right? And does it track and report budget versus actual income and expenses? All right. Is financial reporting regular, current, and sufficient for the board to forecast and monitor the financial status of the organization of the corporation? So, at a minimum, you should have a quarterly report, and really, that really doesn't suffice, especially given all the changes that we're going through in the world. You should, it's recommended that you have monthly financial statements, even if the board only meets quarterly. So you want to make sure that you do regular financial reports. And what those financial reports should include are income statement, balance sheet, a cash flow statement, right? Those are things you share with your board, but internally also need to make sure that you have a bank reconciliation on a monthly basis. Cash flow management. Do you show your current cash position and maintain controls over expenditures? So your current cash position, you'll see that with your cash flow statement, and you'll also see that in your balance sheet. And if you're having any cash flow problems, how often do you experience them and how do you manage them? Internal controls. Do you have adequate internal controls to make sure separation of duties, meaning that there's no one person who has control of every asset of the preparation of financial statements as well as financial management? Do you have sufficient oversight of all of the activities? Do you have any conflicts of interest in your procurement process? Does your organization have a conflict of interest policy that governs the employee and development activities, particularly in procurement of contract services and the award of housing units for occupancy? And this can be applicable, this is applicable for housing, but you can also modify this to fit your own organization's, your own situation, because not every organization is dealing with housing. Do you have adequate insurance, liability, fidelity bond, workers' comp, property and hazard, and project insurance? And again, that is typically for housing developers. If you're not in housing, you definitely need liability insurance. You should also have directors and officers insurance. And these are questions about financial stability. Does your current balance sheet and budget indicate sufficient funds that support operations, right? To what extent does the organization have a diversified and stable funding base for operations? And what portion of the revenues is predictable from year to year? So, do you have funding sources that you know are going to automatically renew, as long as you're in compliance? Or is there funding that, is going to run out and you're not quite sure how you're going to replace that funding source? Does the organization have an established fundraising program for both capital and operational needs? So when we talk about capital, those are those resources that are going to take more than 1 year to expend. So that would be things like equipment, major equipment. It would be things like your building and other construction projects, right? So do you have a program for capital as well as for your day-to-day operating expenses? Your portfolio financial condition. If you have a portfolio of properties, are the properties in stable physical and financial condition, or do they drain your resources as an organization? Does it collect adequate management fees from the properties? And again, if you're not in real estate, a question that you might consider, if you are considering starting a real estate arm of your organization, or if you're considering any other social venture other than the main nonprofit itself. Suppose you want to create a business that will throw off cash to your organization, you want to ask yourself, is this business stable enough that it can sustain the nonprofit and not the other way around? You don't want to drain your nonprofit trying to keep this business afloat. You want to create a sustainable social enterprise such that it can actually support not only itself, but throw off money to support the nonprofit. Liquidity. Does the organization have liquid assets available to cover current expenses? So that would be things like cash, money market accounts. Does it have the funds available for pre-development expenses or equity investments required for development? And if you're not in real estate and if you're thinking about doing, a business, that will help the organization, a social enterprise, you'll ask yourself questions like, do you have the funds to do the research and development, for this new venture? And again, these questions are more or less for real estate development, and this is development capacity. Have you demonstrated capacity for carrying out activities assisted with home funds? And then is there experience of key staff who have completed similar projects for home funded activities or contracts with consultants who have relevant housing experience? So some of those activities might be real estate development for housing, affordable housing. It could be housing counseling. But if you're not in real estate development, if you're in social services, if you're in education, if you're in economic development, the similar question is, do you have capacity, demonstrated capacity within your organization for carrying out the activities that you intend to carry out? In terms of structure, can the organization structure support housing activities, or is there a need for a subsidiary or other organizational structure for future development? Are there operations or activities that need to be organizationally separate from housing development activities and portfolios? Again, this is a question for housing because this is a HUD document, but you can easily take this for yourself if you are, again, any other organization doing social services or education, health and wellness, etc. If you are taking on a new project, you want to consider whether or not this is something the organization can sustain on its own, or does it need to partner with someone? Does it need to create a separate organization? Does the organization's portfolio of projects and properties evidence competent management and oversight? Do the properties appear to have adequate funding? And then you're looking at your previous track record. Have you done CHurl activities previously, and how did you perform? Were you on schedule and within budget? And again, similarly, if you're not doing real estate development, you want to look at your past performance in your other programs. Look at your track record and assess accordingly. Management capacity. Does the current management have the ability to manage additional development activities? And does the organization have the capacity or capabilities to analyze alternative housing projects? And again, if you're not doing housing, do you have the capability to analyze, current opportunities that are before you? Are there corporate lines of authority for development? Are they clear? Are the policies and procedures in place governing development opportunities and activities? And if you're not in housing, you would adjust this accordingly. Make sure that you have corporate lines of authority for all of your activities, for all your programs and services. Are policies and procedures in place for your programs and services? And for project management, does your organization have procedures for monitoring the progress of a project? And does it have the capability to monitor project level cash flow as scheduled? And please bear with me, my allergies are getting to me. Personnel, does it have staff that are assigned responsibilities for housing development? Are personnel policies and job descriptions clear? And for those of you who are not in housing, again, do you have personnel policies in place? Are the job descriptions clear? Staff skills, how strong are staff in the following areas? Market analysis, legal and financial aspects of housing development, management of real estate development, oversight of design and construction management, marketing and intake, and property management if applicable. And for those of you who are not in housing, what you might consider doing for this section is list those major areas that you expect your staff to be competent in. Does your staff have core competencies in the areas that you need them to have the competencies so that you can serve your clients and communities, whether it be through social services, through education, through health and wellness, youth activities, etc. Training. Are staff encouraged to obtain training and develop new skills? What's their potential for learning skills that they don't have? And you might also want to look too at how much money the organization is prepared to spend on training. Another question is the organization's membership active and in support of the housing activities? And when you look at consultants and partners, to what extent does the CHurl have access to and make use of qualified development consultants and partners? And how well do the consultants and partners interact with staff? And are the consultants and partners focused on training CHurl staff and building capacity? So this doesn't necessarily have to be limited to folks who are doing housing. This is for any organization. Do you have access to consultants? And then when you use the consultants, are you working with them in such a way that they're building capacity so that when they leave, the organization is actually stronger? They're not constantly dependent on the consultant. And if they are, at least they're not engaging the same consultant for the same thing over and over. There's growth. Do you have access to funding? So does the organization have funds available for equity or capital advances in housing development projects? Does the organization have the ability to raise funds for the capital requirements of a project? And how strong are the relationships with funders of housing and with lenders? And again, you can tailor this question for your own purposes, regardless of what type of organization you're working with. Opportunity costs. If the organization pursues housing development, what other activities are likely to suffer or not be able to be pursued because they're focusing their resources on development activities? And this is a question that you need to ask if you're not in housing. If you're in an expansion mode, or you see this golden opportunity that seems like it's larger than most other projects and programs, you might want to ask yourself those types of questions. And then finally, has the organization met all of the CHurl regulatory thresholds? And if not, these have to be corrected prior to certification. And this might be true in other areas too. So you want to make sure that you're in compliance with all of your filings as well. And whatever the other government agencies are asking you to do, you got to make sure that you're in compliance with those. Have capacity deficiencies been identified that might need to be addressed prior to the award of CHurl funds or as a condition of commitment? And if not, proceed to a request for CHurl certification and funding. And can the capacity deficiencies be addressed by technical assistance from the PJ or from a certified technical assistance provider? And if so, request technical assistance. So this is one example of of how you can make sure that you are that you're prepared, and make sure that you actually have capacity before you move forward. So at this point, I'm going to open up to questions and comments. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, please feel free to share. If you have any experience in this area, please feel free to share what your experience has been. All righty. Okay, so there doesn't seem to be any question, any comment. I hope that this has been helpful to you, and if not, let me know of some resources that I might help you with. All right, so without further ado, I am going to end this right now. I just want to say thank you so much for your time. And if there's anything I can do to help you, let me know. Take care. Bye bye.